First like to apologize for my voice. My vocal cords seem to be irritated with me. So I'm going to do my best, and I hope everyone can hear, and my enunciation is good enough. Okay, so as the title suggests, I'm going to discuss briefly the topic of introducing Seon Master Daehaeng's teachings to a Canadian classroom. To my knowledge, this has not been done in any comprehensive way outside of the Hanmaum Seon Center of Toronto. And so there will be a lot of trial and error. And I'll be the person who will be giving this a go. It's going to be a very experimental and exploratory approach to the teaching of Master Daehaeng's teachings in a Canadian classroom. Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sorry about that. So psychology has been one of the primary conceptual frameworks through which Buddhism has been interpreted in the West. And in this process, psychology and its concepts and its language has equipped Buddhism with the tools necessary to make its teachings a little bit more relatable to a modern Western audience. Okay. So this kind of approach to the study of Buddhism is part and parcel of the educational programming at the Toronto Center for Applied Buddhism, based in Toronto, Canada. This center offers courses in Buddhist counseling and Buddhist spiritual care. It's a very practice-oriented and it offers practice-oriented courses and practical training to the students who come to this center. This fall, the center will be offering a course called Buddhism and ACT, ACT. This is an acronym for, may I ask someone to change the screens for me as I'm talking? Because I seem to be having trouble with this. As I get older, I seem to have more difficulty with technology. That would be great. Thank you. So the course is called Buddhism and ACT. ACT is an acronym for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And there are going to be 5 facilitators for this course. I am one of these facilitators. I will be teaching one module in this course in November. So I have a couple more months to continue to refine the content of what I'm teaching. And I've been lucky enough to be given that opportunity to teach Seon Master Daehaeng's Kwanpop, or her method of Kwan, to Canadian students. I was very excited to be given this opportunity, but I also was somewhat apprehensive because it's a tall order, in my opinion. It's a challenging task. And one of the reasons I came here today to present is so that I can give all of you some of my ideas for this course, and I can get some feedback on how I can improve it before the first iteration. Okay? Yeah. So this is a team of the 5 facilitators, 4 on the screen, and then including me, there's 5. Next module. Okay. So on a macro level, on a wider scale, this paper argues that the integration of modern Western psychotherapy with Seon Master Daehaeng's method of Seon is a culturally appropriate method or pedagogy in the Canadian context. That's my large-scale argument, I guess you can say. So at this point, I'd like to let you know what my definition of Kwan practice is. And I could be wrong, so I wait for the corrections to come. I define Master Daehaeng's practice of Kwan into 3 core components. Number 1 is putting down one's thoughts, whether negative or positive. 놓는다, 생각을 놓는다. And then number 2, entrusting these thoughts to your fundamental essence. Entrust that your fundamental essence will take care of you and your problems or any issues you have. Okay? That's number 2. 주인공한테 맡긴다. And then number 3 is to continuously observe and watch your thoughts and your actions as you move through daily life. Okay? I just want to get that over with so that I don't have to go back to it when I address these components at a later point in my presentation. So on a micro scale then, we heard the macro. On a micro, in this presentation, I try to show that the psychotherapy called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, is an effective one in terms of as an integrative or heuristic framework through which to teach Master Daehaeng's method of Kwan to the Canadian classroom or to Canadian students. That's one of my micro-level arguments in this paper. The second one is, I argue that certain aspects, there goes my voice again, certain aspects of something called the mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy are compatible with Master Daehaeng's second component in her Kwan practice of entrusting the 주인공 or your fundamental self to take care of you and to solve your issues for you in a wise and skillful way. And because of this compatibility, I argue that teaching Master Daehaeng's Kwan method in Canada at this point in time is actually a good time. It's a good time because Canadian students, American students, I'll include American students as well, seem ripe for the picking. The social milieu is, I think, conducive for this kind of a method to come and make an impact. And I'm going to briefly show that later in the presentation. So, why do we? Some of you might be asking yourselves or thinking, why do we need this additional framework when we're teaching Master Daehaeng's method of Sun? Why can't we just teach Master Daehaeng's method of Sun alone? Well, there's a couple of reasons in my opinion. Number one is because I have to. The title of the course is Buddhism and ACT, and therefore I have to incorporate it. But that's a good thing, because, in my opinion, because the average Canadian young adult, or I'll say the average Canadian post-secondary student, most take a course when they're in university or at the college level called Introduction to Psychology, Psychology 101. And by the time they graduate, they are quite familiar with the concepts and language of psychology. Now, in addition, one of the most popular selling genres of books in the United States and Canada and in many other parts of the world are self-development books, personal self-help books. And these books, for those of you who have looked through them, I have in my spare time, I find the books are filled with the language of Western, modern, contemporary psychology. So what am I trying to say? What is the argument I'm making? I argue that the average Canadian young adult, unless they have engaged in some kind of independent research in Buddhism or on Buddhism, they are much more familiar and accepting of concepts coming from the world or the field of psychology and psychotherapy than they are of Buddhism. So, in that sense, it's advantageous, helpful to have this additional framework to go along with Kun S님's or Master Daehaeng's practice of Kwan. Okay? And the second reason is because a lot of the cross-cultural literature shows that Canadian young adults are very analytical in their cognitive, in the way they reason about things in the world. Okay? And in fact, some of the same research shows that Koreans are less analytic in their approach in their cognitive approach to the world, and they're more intuitive based or experience based. But because Canadian adults are more analytically oriented and they prefer scientifically validated concepts and data, I think this is where psychotherapy can come in and offer that to the Canadian student. Psychotherapies, as I think most of you know, are based on years of research, years of experiments, and years of clinically or scientifically validated data. And if you bring this kind of data to the Canadian student, they're more impressed and they're more likely to be accepting of what is taught alongside this framework of psychology. It's a heuristic framework for the introduction of Master Daehaeng's Kwan method. Okay. Next, please. So, what is ACT? I'm going to start moving along a little quickly here. I think I'm running out of time. What is ACT? What is acceptance and commitment therapy? In a nutshell, the therapy aims to create a meaningful life for clients by helping them to accept the pain that life inevitably brings. And I'm going to use an analogy that is often used by ACT therapists. It's not my own. I wish I could say it is my own, but it's a great analogy, a great metaphor. So next slide, please. It's called the the next one after that. Yeah, before. One before. Yes, it's called the clipboard exercise. And ACT basically claims that we suffer when we experience painful thoughts because of one of two reasons. One is, let me use the first figure here. When we hold up a clipboard close to our face and we hold it tight, can we see what's around us? No. Can we talk to people, communicate with people around us? No. So that's kind of that's akin to holding on to your thoughts, attached to your thoughts very tightly. Okay? Look at the second figure. That's actually not a very good image of a clipboard, but that's the only one I could find. The second image is supposed to show a client trying to throw away his or her clipboard while the therapist pushes back to make sure that the client cannot throw away the clipboard. This is akin to people who, when experiencing negative thoughts or painful thoughts, worrying, anxiety, what do they tend to do? They tend to want to throw these kinds of feelings away, right? Under the rug, push them away, or even throw them through the window. Well, that does not happen in reality. And so the therapist is trying to show when you try to throw away these thoughts, you're trying to actually push a clipboard that is being pushed back at you by this therapist. And so that's why you suffer, because in these two instances, your attention is dominated by these actions, by your clinging or by your pushing away. And in that process, you're actually what they call fusing, F-U-S-I-N-G, fusion. You're melding your thoughts with the I or the ego. And because of this melding, coming together, this merging, you suffer. You suffer. So what's the solution according to ACT? Next slide, please. You just simply lay it down on your lap. In other words, you put it down. Now, it doesn't go away, though. According to ACT, your thoughts, your negative thoughts, your painful thoughts, your anxieties, your worries, what have you, remain in a space in your head. Okay? But at least they're not occupying all of your attention. You have some freedom now. Your ego has some freedom now. And now your ego has the ability to do what? To think about things that are productive and do the things that the ego, the self, wants to do. And the ultimate purpose of ACT is to help the client live a valued and meaningful life. Okay? As I think a lot of you are getting a sense right now that that's quite different than the Buddhist ultimate goal. But I'm trying to show you this so that we can move on to the Buddhist perspective. Thank you. Let me just, you don't have to go back, but I'm going to add one more thing. In order to put down the clipboard on your lap, you need something called psychological flexibility. It's not easy, in other words. If it was easy as that, no one would be suffering in the world, right? So you have to have the ability to be mindful when you see yourself either grabbing the clipboard or pushing it away, and then not react to that reaction. You have to be mindful and strong enough mentally to not react to that situation in order to put it down on your lap. So now, the ACT researchers recognizing that not everyone, let me rephrase that. ACT researchers recognizing that people react differently to diffusion exercises, or the same diffusion exercise loses its vitality or becomes somewhat tedious after repeated usage. These researchers have come up with a toolkit of more than 100 different kinds of diffusion exercises. Diffusion, I don't know if I explained what that means, but I think you can understand. Fusion is that, right? Diffusion is that. The kind of the disentangling of your ego from your thoughts. So here's an example of one of the 100 different kinds of diffusion exercises. This is called leaves on a stream. If you are suffering, you are worrying about something, you take that worry and in your mind's eye, you place it on a leaf, on a stream, and then you let it flow downstream. Okay? If that doesn't work for you, then next slide, please. There's the holding the suitcase on a capsizing boat exercise. So this is an example of a person who, when he or she suffers, they actually cling tightly to their suffering or those thoughts that make them suffer. And the therapist will say, the reason for this is because the client actually believes, even though he or she doesn't like these negative thoughts, he or she believes those negative thoughts are true. So for example, I am somebody who can never be loved. This thought will enter the head of some people and cause them anguish. But some people actually believe this to be true. And so they're like the person tightly holding on to a suitcase on a capsizing boat. And what does the therapist do in that case? Well, the therapist says, you don't want to let go because it's full of precious belongings, but it's dragging you down, pulling you under the water. What would you do? The client would respond, let go of it. And the therapist would then add, right. And once you let go, you could put your energy into doing something useful, right? So in other words, as I said earlier, the client has set aside these negative thoughts, even though they don't go away, but it's far enough to the side that the client can see clearly ahead of him or her, and now move on to live a life that's meaningful to that person, that's according to that person's values. Next, please. So what I've said right now, up to now, represents the first half of my module that I'll be teaching at TCAB, at the Toronto Centre for Applied Buddhism. The next or second half will be talking about the Kwan method, And I'll start I'll compare the two first, and then I will begin with the similarities between the two approaches. Why? Because when you begin with the similarities between Master Daehaeng's Kwan method, spiritual practice, and the method of ACT, at least the student has something familiar to work with in the beginning. And therefore, this might breed a sense of familiarity and therefore receptivity to the teachings, to these foreign teachings of Master Daehaeng. So here's a list of the similarities. Both ACT and the Kwan method propose to, at least, in the very least, reduce suffering for the client or the practitioner. That's one similarity. Number two, you might be surprised, probably not. This might be because it's the first time you're hearing this. The Kwan method actually, in my opinion, I argue, utilizes the principles of diffusion and acceptance in the Kwan method. How so? Well, when let's go back to the first component of Master Daehaeng's Kwan method of letting go, putting down your thoughts. In order to do that, this in itself is diffusion. Why? Let's go back to my hands, my pretty hands, and see that fusion is the coming together, right, of thought, bad, negative thoughts, and the ego. And then when you realize your thoughts are actually coming from a different source than the ego, which Master Daehaeng argues, or claims, or states, I should say, or teaches. That's probably the better word. Teaches. She teaches that it's not you, the ego, that has produced these thoughts. It's coming from your fundamental essence. So in that moment when you realize that the origin of the thought is not you, but some other place within you, deep within you, the thought becomes diffused and goes somewhere else. And in that sense, it's a process of diffusion, just like ACT. And I will be saying these kinds of things when I'm teaching the Kwan method. And then we have acceptance. Let's go to the second component of Master Daehaeng's Kwan method, of trusting that your fundamental essence within you has the ability to take care of things for you. Well, this whole process, the first component and the second component of putting down your thoughts, and then entrusting that your inner self, deep inner self, can solve these problems for you. This is actually indicative of you accepting these negative thoughts. Why? Because the whole time you're engaging in this process, you're actually holding on to these thoughts. You're not reacting to them. You're not kicking them out. You're not holding them tightly. If you did, you probably wouldn't do a very good job of this Kwan method. So I argue that the Kwan method also involves the principle of acceptance and is similar to ACT in this way. Number three, requires psychological flexibility. Just like ACT, when you engage in the Kwan method, it's not easy. At least I don't think so. I've done it on a personal level. It's a very difficult process. It takes years. Even today, after I think I've been practicing for 30 years, I still have difficulties. So it does require you to be flexible. In other words, requires you to be resilient and strong mentally, because you're holding these thoughts that you don't like at all. You'd rather kind of kick them out. It's like dynamite. You'd rather throw them out somewhere before it blows up in your face. And then three, commitment. I didn't mention this earlier, but I should have. In ACT, when you you make the decision to live a life that's according to your values. Well, that's called commitment. That's the commitment part in ACT. You're committed to live every day according to your values after you set aside your negative thoughts. In the Kwan method, Master Daehaeng, she doesn't talk about living a valued life, at least not, she doesn't emphasize that point, but she does emphasize the third component of the Kwan method, which is what? Which is constant observation, vigilant observation of your actions, your thoughts. Where are they coming from? Is it coming from my ego, myself? Fascinating. You have to instill in yourself this curious attitude and doubt where these thoughts are coming from. Don't think it's just coming from you or who you think you are. They're coming from another source, the fundamental essence. So there's this commitment to constantly observe. It's not, basically what I'm trying to say is it's not a temporary activity. You don't do it at 1 a.m. and then forget about it for 23 hours. You have to do it constantly, but it's a difficult process. Next. So once the similarities have been established, the facilitator, myself, will then turn everyone's attention to the differences between ACT and the Kwan method. And number one, I think you guys can guess, I talked a little bit about fundamental essence, 주인공. For those of you who've been here from day one, you've probably heard this quite a few times, this term. And there are many, many words that are used for this concept. So just be aware of that. In ACT, there is no need to believe in this transcendental, I'm going to call it a transcendental entity, like the 주인공, like one's fundamental essence. ACT does not require you, the client, to do that. But in the Kwan method, yes, of course, that's central to the Kwan method. look at component number 1. You have to believe, right? When you let go of your thoughts, when you put them down, where are you putting them down to? You're returning them to your true self. You're putting them down to your foundational self, right? And then when you're entrusting, or you're trusting that someone's going to take care of the issue for you, who are you trusting? You're trusting, again, the 주인공. And then when you're in the third component, when you're observing your actions and your thoughts, who are you observing? Well, you're observing yourself, but maybe you're not observing the ego. You're observing, again, the fundamental essence, where everything truly comes from, the origin, the true origin of your thoughts and behavior. And then number 2, I say, in ACT, it's designed to help the client live a meaningful life. In the Kwan method, I argue that Master Daehaeng's method is designed to help the practitioner transcend the self. There's not much, from my understanding, there's not too much talk by Master Daehaeng about living a life that you want and living it according to your values. It's more about realizing the origin, the true source of all of your worries and your thoughts, and then transcending the self. It's a spiritual process. This is a more secular process. Okay, next please.
You have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. Very good. So, finally, I'm going to talk about SBNR and mindfulness movement. Next slide, please. Now, I think, I don't know about you, but in my humble opinion, I think the concept of the 주인공 is a transcendental one, and therefore, I expect some of my Canadian students in the fall, when I teach this course, might be a little averse, or a little, might not be accepting, or might be a little close-minded about this kind of a transcendental concept, because it does require belief, but belief in something that's not seen. You don't see it with your own eyes. So if you don't see it with your own eyes, how can you believe it? It becomes a little tough, and I expect my students will be the same. So that's my thought process. However, there are 2 movements, or we can say trends in North America, contemporary trends. One's called spiritual but not religious people. This is a growing group, demographic in Canada and the United States, of people who seek spirituality, but they don't want to do it within the context of a traditional religion because it's too dogmatic, it's too rigid. Next, please. And then we have MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy. This is another very popular therapy in Canada, in the US, in many parts of the world. And in this therapy, we find that there are many similarities to the second component of the Kwan method. The second component. How so? Well, because I'm short on time, I'm not going to go into detail, but I will say that instead of 주인공 or Buddha nature, the founder of this therapy, Jon Kabat-Zinn, I think a lot of you have heard of this name, he talks about intrinsic goodness. Everyone deep inside, underlying their ego, is an intrinsic goodness. We are all good, pure, wholesome, underneath everything, underneath it all. And he says, since that is the case, when we are suffering, we should rely on this intrinsic goodness. When we experience emotional turmoil, when we're going back and forth, let's remember that the intrinsic goodness is there for us. And we are inside, we are not swaying back and forth. Maybe we are in our heads, but not inside. This is very similar to Master Daehaeng's concept or the second component of relying on the 주인공 when you're suffering, when you're going through emotional turmoil. She often uses the analogy of the tree with deep roots, right? When it's extremely windy weather, what happens to a tree with deep roots? The branches go back and forth, but the roots, because they're so sturdy and long, the tree never breaks. It bends, but it does not break. And this is similar to what Jon Kabat-Zinn is arguing about our intrinsic goodness. Even though you might bend when you're suffering, your intrinsic goodness is always there for you. So rely on it. And I found this very similar to Master Daehaeng's second component. And I'm just going to go back to the SBNR slide. Why did I bring that up? Because one of the primary or main characteristics of SBNR, spiritual but not religious, is that they do not want to, I shouldn't generalize and say everybody, every SBNR person, but in general, they do not want to rely on religious texts for answers when they're suffering. For guidance, they don't want to look to a local religious clergy. What would they rather do? They would rather, according to the article that I read, and if you want any of the resources, you let me know, they would rather rely on their gut feeling, on their intuition, which I found fascinating because in my previous research, Americans, Canadians were the opposite. They rather rely on their intellect when they're faced with tough questions. So maybe the millennial generation is changing. This movement is prevalent, especially among millennials, so people born between 1981 and 1996. And these two contemporary trends of MBSR and SBNR, I almost got them mixed up a little bit, bodes well for the introduction of the Kwan method in Canada. Phew. Pardon me, that was a big fly. So in that sense, I'm looking forward. I'm actually excited to start teaching in November, even though it's just 2 hours in one class. And I would like to come back one day. I have this in my conclusion here, but that's like 2 pages away, so I'll say it right now. I would like to get feedback from my students after I teach that class, and then bring it to the Hanmaum Kwahagwon, to the Hanmaum Science Institute, and report to them. And let them know what Canadian students are experiencing. We should always be sensitive to cultural differences, in my opinion. I lived it. I've lived these differences, and that's why I have this confidence that cultural issues are very important. And I will come back and hopefully one day be given the opportunity to share the results of my research. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. Okay. 네, 캐나다 대학생들이면 상당히 문화가 다를 텐데.
I believe that Canadian students have a whole different culture, so it will be so fascinating for you to teach this Seon Master Daehaeng's teachings to the Canadian students. We are running out of time, so we'll have just short Q&A session.
네. 캐나다에서 와주셔서 이렇게 귀한 경험을 지금 되게 어려운 환경에서
Thank you for introducing the Canadian culture and
이제 이런 공부를 하고 싶어하는 사람들한테 전달하는 방법에 대해서 이제 얘기를 해주셨는데
you introduced the methodology of how you will teach Seon Master Daehaeng's teachings to the Western students.
개선시켜 나갈 수 있을까를 항상 연구하고 있기 때문에 좋은 그 경험이 된 것 같습니다. 참고가 되었습니다.
So I learned a lot, and it was a good reference from your speech.
학교에서 가르치기도 하고
I teach students different religion and encounter with other students with different religion.
잠재력을 믿고 그리고 그것을 해결할 수 있다고 생각하고 나아가라. 그러니까 관법이라는 것이 부처라는 것을 이름 짓지 않고 네 마음, 너 자신으로부터 이제.
So what I teach is emphasizes that trust in your dormant capability and trust your inner power that can address and counter everything, and that you have the Buddha nature.
어떤 컨셉트가 아니라 그냥 너 자신에서부터 출발하고 너 자신을 발견하고 너 자신을 실험해봐라 하는 것이 어떤 관법의 그 기본이 아닐까 싶은데.
I believe not conceptually,
어떻게 생각하시고
but
어떤 것을
it's my own opinion that Kwan method of Kwan is to discover
later in
Buddha nature.
in my presentation, because John Kabat-Zinn brings up or uses the term intrinsic goodness or purity or wholesomeness, which are not so technical when we say 주인공 or Buddha nature, this sounds very difficult right away. And it might be off-putting for a lot of Canadian students who are taking Buddhist classes for the first time. I should have added earlier that on average, the students who come to the Toronto Center for Applied Buddhism, half are about Buddhist, half identify as Buddhist, and the other half do not. But they come because they've read about Buddhism and there's something fascinating about the religion, but they're not quite ready to identify with it. So you're dealing with this kind of a student. And if that's the case, as you put it, I think it's a good idea, a wise idea, not to, or to maybe refrain as much as possible, to minimize the number of times you do use these religious terms. And I did think about the term, in fact, I ended my presentation on paper with the question, maybe we can not only, maybe as the facilitator for this course, I can not only borrow these such terms as I am originally pure or good or wholesome. I can say, I can refer to this 주인공 as inherent potential or unlimited potential. I think that word was actually used by Venerable Chonggo S님 yesterday. I'm not sure. Somebody used that word, and I wrote it down. Excuse me. I wrote it down because I thought, oh, here's another word I might be able to use in the classroom come November. So certainly, I'm thinking about that. And if you have any other words besides infinite potential or just the self, you can let me know, and I will be sure to look at it and think about it.